Well, good evening. I just want to add my welcome to Jez's. I'm one of the vicars here. I'm Rachel, and it's great to see you here this evening. You might, if you were here last week, have seen that we, over the next sort of 4 weeks, are doing a deep dive into Psalm 23. It's a very famous psalm, and last week we looked at the first couple of verses. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And I talked a little bit about how David in that psalm was talking about his reliance on God day by day. As a sheep is reliant on the shepherd for all of their needs, I was talking a little bit about what it means to go deeper with God and to really rely on him for all of our needs. And today we're just going to look at one verse, which is verse 4, which I think is hopefully going to come on the screen here. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. As I said last week, David wrote this psalm later on in his life. And you know, David's life was not without complication. He faced tragedy and betrayal and shame. You know, he was a kind of person who knew what it was to go through a dark, dark valley. And yet he was also, because of his faith and the depth that he had in his relationship with God, he was able to say, despite that, even though that, I trust in God and I will fear no evil. And that's a little bit of the theme that we want to explore tonight. Just a moment, I'm going to interview my friend, Hannah Holloway, who is also a member of our congregation here at St. Stephen's. And she's going to be speaking a little bit about her work with IJM, the International Justice Mission. But just before that, I just wanted to say that the reason why, as Christians, we can be people who, even though we walk through the darkest valley, and even though in our world there is so much darkness, we can be people who fear no evil. That's because of Jesus, because he was the one ultimately who triumphed over all death and darkness and suffering in rising from the dead. And in this interview with Hannah, there are going to be some difficult themes that we talk about. We're not going to shy away from that. And there might be some of the things that we talk about that are difficult to hear. And if that raises stuff for you and you'd like someone to talk to you about that or to pray with you at the end, then we would love to do that. But the reason why we're going there is because this is what the psalmist David does. He talks about a dark, dark valley, but then he also speaks of the hope that is in knowing God, and that because of God and because what God did in Jesus, we needn't fear evil. So, without me wittering on and on, would you give Hannah a massive clap as she comes up to the stage? Hi, Hannah. Welcome. So, Hannah, you and your husband, Josh, have been worshipping with us at St. Stephen's for about a year. Is that right?
Yeah, a year now.
And I know Hannah quite well. She's in my life group. But for the benefit of those that don't know you, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I'm Hannah, and my husband is Josh. You might have seen him do some of the worship here. We moved to Twickenham last March. We got married 3 weeks before the pandemic, just snuck in there. And came to Twickenham, went into a lockdown, which was quite a difficult time to move somewhere new. But we've loved being part of St. Stephen's. We were part of the congregation online for a while, and then started coming to in person, often to the 6. So that's been really great. And as you know, I work for IJM. And my husband, Josh, works for Tear Fund. He would be here tonight, but he's actually in South Sudan with Tear Fund right now. He watched Rachel preach online this morning, which is cool. But yeah, he's working to teach the team in South Sudan about some software to kind of help improve the global systems in Tear Fund. So he's there for 3 weeks. Yeah, that's kind of us.
Great intro. And I want to ask you, so through lockdown, what was your kind of go-to in getting you through those long days stuck at home?
Yeah, it was the West Wing for me. I don't know if there's any West Wing fans here, but
so the very keen one there. Yeah, fantastic.
Absolutely
Me too.
Love it. Absolutely loved it. It what got me through.
So did you watch the whole lot?
Oh yeah, start to end. I had to limit myself to like 3 episodes a day because, there's only so much you can do. And I wanted it to last, especially by the end. I was like, oh, it's going to finish.
String it out.
Yeah.
Fantastic. That's great. Well, could you just maybe then share with us a little bit about your work with IJM? What do they do for people that might not be familiar with their work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I work for IJM, or International Justice Mission, and we're a global team of lawyers, investigators, social workers, and other professionals working to protect people in poverty from violence. And we have 24 offices around the world, and we particularly work to protect people from slavery, violence against women and children, and the police abuse of power. I don't know if you know this, but although slavery has been outlawed in pretty much every country around the world, there's an estimated 40 million people held in slavery today, in brick kilns and garment factories and brothels and many other things as well. And the reason that this happens is because criminals and abusers are able to violently exploit people because they know they can get away with it. The law enforcement is often broken or corrupt, and this leads to people, the poorest and the most vulnerable people, being exploited because there's no one there to protect them, and they have no access to justice. And there's actually an estimated 5 billion people who live outside the protection of the law. And to give you an idea of what that means, if you imagine for a moment that you're at home and someone is trying to rob you or is threatening to hurt you, it would be like calling 999 and no one coming. It would be being utterly alone in the face of violence. And that's what we do at IJM. We're working to protect people in poverty from this kind of violence, to kind of restrain the hand of the oppressor.
Wow. What a summary of amazing, incredible work that you do. And I think that's a really helpful example for us. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? But actually, we would assume if you pick up the phone that someone would come to rescue. So I guess in your work, day by day, you see a lot of dark valleys. You see a lot of suffering and a lot of death. And I just wonder if you could give us like a specific example of that. Could you share someone's story with us?
Yeah, I want to tell you about a lady called Joy. And when Joy was younger, when she was 10 years old, she was born in a fairly poor family in the Philippines. Her father worked abroad, so she was passed from kind of family member to family member. And when she was 10 years old, this lady approached her and her friends and offered her a cleaning job. And they accepted the job. They needed the money. And this lady, they called her their boss. It quickly became apparent that it wasn't a cleaning job. She was actually sexually exploiting them online via a video web camera that would be viewed across the world by paying people who wanted to view this. And this is known as OSEC, or online sexual exploitation of children. And it's by far the darkest thing that I've ever come across, like the most kind of evil thing that we at IJM have encountered. And I guess like in the past, when people wanted to exploit children, they would have to travel to the Philippines or other places around the world to do it. But since the rise of the internet, you don't need to even leave your home anymore. You can access this content where you can direct the live abuse of children from the safety of your home, which is just awful. And you can imagine over the last year, we've been in a pandemic. We've all been locked in our homes. People have spent more time on the internet. And so we've seen OSEC crimes just exponentially increase. And in the Philippines and in other places, these children, they're literally locked in with their abusers, who are often kind of close, either family or friends. So it's really heavy stuff. And Joy, she faced this for 7 years. And And devastatingly, at IJM, over half of the survivors that we've worked with and taken to safety from crimes of OSEC, they've been under the age of 12. So we're talking about really young children. But thankfully, this wasn't the end of Joy's story. IJM and partners, we had information given to us of Joy and her whereabouts. And we were able, with our team in Cebu, to conduct an investigation and a rescue operation. And 16 survivors were taken out of this place, out of this home, including Joy. And she was taken to safety. She worked with our social workers to be restored and to have trauma-informed care. And amazingly, she's now an incredible advocate. She speaks all around the world, sharing her story and inviting people into the movement to help stop slavery and violence. And so when I joined IJM 3 years ago, she'd actually just been in the UK speaking at some of the Christian festivals, sharing her story. I just think she's incredibly brave. And I guess one of the things that really gives me hope about this really, really sad and heavy and dark violence is that we're seeing real change. So earlier last year, we celebrated our 100th conviction of crimes of OSEC in the Philippines. And 10 years ago, there was none, never been one before. So we're seeing this systemic change happen where children are being protected and they're kept safe from experiencing that kind of violence.
Wow, thank you for sharing Joy's story. And also, just thank you for talking about this stuff, because it is really heavy. It's hard to say, it's hard to hear it, but it's so important that we hear the stories of where God is at work through IJM and where there's those stories of healing and restoration. I guess I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, Hannah, and imagining that this is what fills my inbox, and this is the stuff that you're dealing with day in, day out. And just kind of bouncing off the psalm and what David says when, he says, even though I walk through this dark valley, I will fear no evil, that kind of even though moment. I'm just interested for you day to day, how do you stay in that even though place, that all this darkness that you see doesn't overcome you?
Yes, so IJM is a Christian organization, and I really believe that our faith is the only way we're able to do what we do every single day, knowing that God is good, that he's faithful, even in the midst of witnessing incredible violence and horror. And there's kind of three key things that we really hold on to kind of do this work, and in that kind of balance between being in the valley and knowing that God is good. The first is recognizing that it's God's weight. So even though that we see and we experience injustice and suffering every single day, ultimately it's God's weight to bear. We can't take the weight of it on ourselves. God cares about this infinitely more than we ever could. I think sometimes we're so passionate about justice, and then we remember that God is 100,000 times more passionate than we are. He cares so much about the injustice that we face, and he cares so deeply about justice and righteousness. And so we have to take the weight off ourselves and throw it back onto God, because he can handle it and we can't. And I think if we try and hold on to that weight ourselves, we'll be crushed by it. So at IJM, if we carried the weight of 40 million people being held in slavery, it would crush us. It would just crush us. So instead, we have to learn how to throw that weight onto God, because it's his redemptive story, right? He's invited us into the work that he's already doing. And so it's his responsibility, and he gets the glory for doing it. So, we have to throw off the weight. And to be able to throw off the weight, we have to stay close to the Father. And we do that. We have to spend time with God. And at IJM, we're actually contracted to pray for an hour a day. So we spend 30 minutes of stillness in the morning, which is time on our own with God. And then we have another 30 minutes later in the day of team prayers where we kind of gather together, we give thanks to God, and then we kind of lift up prayer requests of what's happening around the world. And we ask for his insight and his wisdom to do the work. And sometimes this is in the middle of like huge deadlines and there's rescues happening, there's court procedures going on, but we still gather because we really believe that we have to prioritize that time with God, like staying close to the Father to do the hard work. So staying close to Father. And then one of the third ways is lamenting. So about saying to God, like, things are not how they should be. And just being honest about that, like honest with our pain, honest with our anger about injustice that we see. Even recently, we worked with a survivor called Abba, and she had been sexually exploited for a couple of years in South Asia. And our teams had worked with her, and we'd got her case into court. And she really bravely testified against her trafficker. And we actually just found out in March that all 11 suspects in her case were acquitted. So they were just let off completely. And so we were just devastated. And, you know, you can imagine, like, justice didn't come. So we lamented. We got on our knees in, you know, all the time zones that we work in, all the languages we speak in, and said, God, where is the justice? Where are you in this situation? This is not how it should be. And I kind of think that it's just so important that in times where we face evil and we feel that we're in the valley, that we just have to be honest with God about that. Like, we have to come with him and share how we feel. It's kind of part of that throwing off the weight. It's recognizing that we can't hold it in and we have to give it to God. So, yeah, lamenting is a really key thing. But then the final thing is about chasing joy. And when I mean joy, I mean like the biblical characteristic of God, not joy, who I talked about earlier. We have to chase joy. We have to be people who consistently recover joy. Because if we just wallow in the darkness, it will crush us. We'll burn out. So we need to chase it, and we need to be silly. We need to eat good food and go on a hike and, you know, do all the things that give us joy. Because I think joy is the oxygen of doing hard things. It's like coming up for air. And I always think of the verse in the Bible where it says, the joy of the Lord is our strength. And it really is. Like, it's like coming up and breathing, and then being able to go back and look into the dark place, coming from a place of knowing God's joy. So those would be like the four key things.
Amazing. That's so helpful for us, isn't it? So eloquently talked through the ways in which you try to get to that even though place with the stuff that you're facing. And actually it just makes me think of David in the Psalms. All of those things that you say are things that David does at times, doesn't he? If you read through his Psalms, at times he says he puts the weight back onto God. He draws close to the Father, and he laments. He does all of those things. And, you know, this series is all about going deeper with God. What are the ways in which we can grow in those practices with some of the stuff that we face in our own lives, but also the stuff that we see in our world that is just not okay. So thank you. That's really helpful. And just finally, Hannah, I've got to know you a little bit over this past year, which has been a real joy for me. But I just wondered, having kind of spoken about your work with IJM, if you would be able to maybe just share personally about, you know, a valley that you've been through, and moments perhaps when you've made that pivot of saying, even though this is really hard, I'm not going to fear evil.
Yeah, I think for me, a real kind of valley that I faced was when I was in my late teens. I went to a very large girls' school, and I was a head girl, which, if you know me, kind of tracks. And
me too, actually. We're like fellow head girls.
And I was very active in my youth group. I was leading a lot of stuff, and I was also dating the popular boy in the youth group. not Josh, I'd like to point out.
No, I didn't manage that. I didn't get the popular boy in the youth group.
But in all of these things, which were huge blessings, they also just came with huge pressure. I really felt like all eyes were on me, people kind of waiting for me to almost trip up. And I felt very consumed by what people thought of me. Was I doing enough? Did I look the right way? Did I have the grades that I needed? So I was desperate to get into St. Andrews. And I felt this pressure and this real sense of expectation upon myself. And yeah, this weight, I guess, kind of like I was talking about, this weight to be perfect. And that became kind of the most important thing for me. And a few months later, the popular boyfriend broke up with me very out of the blue. And this was just like that real moment of like, well, I failed. I haven't matched the expectations that I'd set for myself. And I just really felt very, very vulnerable and very kind of like everything I'd worked towards was now in jeopardy. And I'd lost control. Like, you know, how desperate we often feel to feel like we're in control of our lives. And I was desperate to get that back. And, you know, I think each of us often have our own habits of doing that, and often wrongly. And for me, that was through my food. I lost a lot of weight, and I was on this very restrictive diet where I wouldn't let myself, we didn't eat out at all, and I would cook all the food in my family so that I would know what was going into it. And it was just a very dark place. It was a lonely place, and it was also filled with a kind of pride of this control that I had managed to put over myself, where I'd think like, oh, I can't believe someone could just eat a chocolate brownie and not feel guilty about it. It was a real, it was a chaining of kind of control that I had placed on myself, and I felt really trapped. It was really dark. I kind of pushed myself away from my friends, all to kind of hold on to this control. But thankfully, I was able to chat with someone at my church, and she'd known me for a very long time, and she just started reminding me about how God saw me. I very much believed that God was in control of my life, but I began to realize that I really wasn't in any way showing that in how I lived. Like I was gripping onto this self-control in a really unhealthy way. And she, just so gently shared and reminded me that God saw me and he loved me. And he wanted me to live in freedom, a life that was without chains, without like imposed self-control upon myself. And so kind of slowly I began to have a more healthy relationship with food. And I guess that was a real moment of like in that dark valley of realizing that God was with me, that I wasn't kind of through it, but he was very much in that place with me, and that I could still experience his goodness. And then I think like the real moment that I kind of felt this shift and of God kind of breaking into the valley was like a year later. This church leader came and prayed for me, and I didn't know her at all well. But you know those moments where someone just prays into you and they just like absolutely nail it? It's like it's gone like straight into your heart. It was one of those moments. And she shared this picture of a girl like running barefoot across a grassy meadow and like carefree, just running around in joy. And she was like, this is how God sees you. This is how he wants you to be, like in this place of freedom, in this place of real joy, of knowing that you are loved by God and knowing that you can accept yourself. I guess like the sense of I didn't need to be chained by the responsibilities that I felt, but they were something that I could like throw the weight onto God, that he'd given me gifts to use, but I wasn't meant to have a life constrained by them. And that picture is something I've just clung on to forever going forwards, because it's just a beautiful reminder of how God sees each of us. And even when we feel like we're in that valley, when we're in that place that it feels like there's no escape and that we're just like crying to be taken out of, that God, like, he reaches in, that he's in it with us, like it says in the verse, you are with me in that dark place. And I think that's partly why I care so much about the work of IJM, this work of bringing freedom, like God's redemptive power. Like, I've seen that in my own life, and I'm just like so passionate about others seeing that too, in many different ways. But I just think God, like, throughout the Bible, talks about freedom from the captives, freedom from our sin, freedom just, living this life that is, experiencing the joy of knowing and loving God. I think that's been a really transformational thing for me.
Wow. Oh, man, thanks so much. What an encouraging testimony. Should we clap? Amazing.